Welcome to the Deep Sleep channel. Tonight, we're traveling back 500 years. We're entering medieval England during a time of political upheaval and dangerous ambition. We're exploring one of history's greatest mysteries. A mystery that has captivated historians, inspired novels, and challenged our understanding of power and morality. This is the story of the Princes in the Tower, two young boys who disappeared without a trace in 1483. Two heirs to the English throne who vanished behind the stone walls of the Tower of London. Two children whose fate remains unknown after 5 centuries. Were they murdered? Were they smuggled away to safety? Did they die of natural causes? Were they victims of a diabolical conspiracy? Did their own uncle orchestrate their disappearance? Or were they killed by someone else entirely? The facts are simple. Two young princes entered the Tower of London as the guests of their uncle Richard III. They were never seen again. What happened to them in those walls remains one of history's most enduring mysteries. Close your eyes. Let yourself travel back to 15th century England. Let yourself meet these young boys. Let yourself witness the political machinations surrounding their disappearance. Let yourself contemplate one of the greatest mysteries ever told. Let yourself drift into sleep wondering about the truth that may never be known. This is a meditation on mystery, on ambition, on the vulnerability of innocence, and on the ways that history can be rewritten by the victor. To understand the mystery of the Princes in the Tower, we must first understand the political landscape of medieval England. The year was 1483. England was ruled by King Edward IV, who had reigned for over 20 years. Edward was a powerful and respected king. He had established stability after years of civil war. He had expanded England's power and influence. Edward IV had married for love rather than political advantage, which was unusual for a king. He married Elizabeth Woodville, a widow with children from a previous marriage. This marriage created tension with the English nobility because Elizabeth came from a relatively minor family. The nobility worried that her relatives would gain too much power and influence. But despite these tensions, Edward IV ruled firmly and effectively. He had several children with Elizabeth, including 2 sons. The eldest son, Edward, was born in 1470. The second son, Richard, was born in 1473. These boys were the heirs to the English throne. They represented the future of England and the continuation of the royal line. Then, in 1483, King Edward IV died unexpectedly. He was only 40 years old. He seemed to be in good health, but suddenly he became ill and died. His death created a crisis. The eldest son, young Edward, was only 13 years old. He was too young to rule alone. Someone would need to serve as regent and guide the kingdom during his minority. Edward IV had named his brother Richard as the executor of his will and the protector of his sons. Richard was the Duke of Gloucester. He had served Edward loyally for years. He had ruled the north of England effectively. He seemed like a reasonable choice to protect the young king and guide the kingdom. But other noble families had their own ambitions. The Woodville family, the relatives of the Queen, also sought power and influence. They wanted to control the young king and shape his reign to their advantage. A struggle for power began immediately after Edward IV's death. Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, moved quickly. He intercepted the young king and his retinue as they traveled from Wales toward London. He claimed he was protecting the young king from the Woodville family, whom he portrayed as a dangerous influence. He took custody of the young king and brought him to London. Richard then took custody of the second young prince as well, the 8-year-old Richard. He brought both boys to the Tower of London. The Tower was a royal residence but also a fortress. It was the place where royalty traditionally stayed when they were in London. The boys were placed in the Tower for their protection, according to Richard's explanation. At this point, the boys were not prisoners. They were treated well. They had servants, they had entertainment, they had communication with the outside world. They were the heirs to the throne, waiting for the older brother to reach an age where he could rule alone. But then something changed. Richard made a stunning announcement. He claimed that the marriage of Edward IV to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid. He claimed that Edward had been secretly married to another woman before marrying Elizabeth. Therefore, the children of Edward and Elizabeth were not legitimate heirs to the throne. This claim was shocking and controversial. There was no clear evidence to support it, but Richard presented it to Parliament, and Parliament voted to accept his claim. The two young princes were declared illegitimate. They were removed from the line of succession. With the young princes removed from the line of succession, Richard had no legitimate obstacle to the throne. He declared himself king. He became Richard III, King of England. The boys remained in the Tower. They were now the children of a deposed and illegitimate former king. They were no longer heirs. They were simply two young boys whose future was uncertain. In the summer of 1483, the boys were last seen. Chroniclers who lived at the time reported that the boys were frequently seen at the windows of the Tower, playing and looking out at the city. They were visible to guards and servants. They seemed to be in good health. Then, gradually, the sightings ceased. The boys were no longer seen at the windows. They were no longer seen in the courtyards. They were no longer seen anywhere. Rumors began to circulate. Some people said the boys had been smuggled out of the Tower by loyal servants or sympathetic nobles. Perhaps they lived their lives in hiding, known only to a few trusted people. This theory has some appeal because it suggests a more optimistic outcome for the innocent boys. Some historians have pointed to an impostor who appeared years later claiming to be one of the young princes. A man named Perkin Warbeck claimed in the 1490s to be Richard the younger prince. He was supported by various European powers who opposed Richard III and Henry VII. He claimed he had escaped from the Tower and had been living in hiding. But eventually Warbeck was captured and executed. Whether he was truly the escaped prince or simply an impostor remains unclear. Perhaps the boys died of natural causes. The Tower was not a healthy place to live for extended periods. The air was damp, disease was common. Perhaps the boys became ill and died. Perhaps their deaths were covered up by Richard to avoid questions about whether he had murdered them. Perhaps the boys were murdered but not by Richard. Perhaps they were killed after Richard's death by another ambitious noble. Perhaps someone else decided they were a threat and had them eliminated. The evidence is frustratingly ambiguous. There are no definitive records of what happened to the boys. No contemporary document explicitly states that they were murdered. No contemporary document explicitly states that they escaped. The boys simply vanished, and the mystery has remained unsolved for 5 centuries. 1674, workmen renovating the Tower of London discovered bones buried beneath a staircase. The bones were thought to possibly be the remains of the young princes. The bones were placed in an urn and buried in Westminster Abbey, the church where English royalty was traditionally interred. But were these bones actually the remains of the princes? In 1933, an examination of the bones was conducted. The examination suggested that the bones could be consistent with the remains of 2 young boys of approximately the right age. But the examination was not conclusive. The bones were incomplete. There were no unique identifying features that would definitively prove that these were the remains of the young princes. In 2014, a more sophisticated analysis was conducted using modern forensic techniques. DNA from the bones was compared to DNA from living descendants of the royal family. The analysis suggested that the bones were indeed from the time period when the princes disappeared, and that they could be consistent with young boys of the right age. But again, the analysis was not definitively conclusive. There was no DNA of known identity to compare with, so absolute proof remained elusive. Let's examine the case of against Richard III as the murderer. Richard had other options available to him. He could have kept the boys in the Tower indefinitely. He could have had them killed if that were his intention, but there was no need to hide the deed. He could have announced that they had died of disease or accident. People would likely have believed him. Richard ruled for only 2 years before being defeated and killed in battle. If Richard had murdered the boys, his crime was either discovered after his death or remained a secret. If it was discovered, why did his successors not use it as evidence of his guilt? Instead, the mystery persists. Richard's supporters have argued that he was not the murderer. They point out that many of the damaging accounts of Richard's crimes were written by people who lived after his death. These accounts were influenced by the propaganda of Henry VII, who defeated Richard and became king. Henry VII and his successors had an interest in portraying Richard as a villain. Stories of Richard murdering the young princes made him look evil and reinforced the idea that he was a tyrant who had to be overthrown. If Richard III did not murder the boys, who did? One possibility is that Henry VII, Richard's successor, murdered the boys. Henry VII defeated Richard at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. He became king. He then married Elizabeth of York, the sister of the young princes, to strengthen his claim to the throne and to unite the factions that had been fighting over the English crown. But Henry VII might have seen the young princes as a threat. They were still of royal blood. There were people who might support their restoration. Eliminating them would have secured Henry's position on the throne. But there is a problem with this theory. Henry VII took custody of the boys when he became king, but by that time they had already disappeared years earlier. The boys disappeared in 1483. Richard died in 1485. If the boys had been alive when Henry VII became king, it would have been relatively easy for Henry to arrange their deaths. But the boys appear to have already been dead or disappeared by that time. Another possibility is that the boys escaped and lived lives in hiding. This theory appeals to our sense of hope and justice. Rather than a tragedy, the story would have been a clever escape and years of hidden survival. The case for this theory includes the appearance of Perkin Warbeck in the 1490s. Warbeck claimed to be Richard the younger prince. He was supported by various European powers. His story was detailed and plausible. He knew information about the royal family that seemed to confirm his identity. But Warbeck's claim could also be explained by the fact that he was an impostor who had studied the details of royal life and had learned information that allowed him to pass as the prince. Impostors have often been remarkably successful at convincing people of false identities. It is not clear whether Warbeck was the true prince or a convincing fraud. Let's consider what we know about the Tower of London during this period. The Tower was a working royal residence. It was not a secret place where activities could be hidden indefinitely. There were guards, there were servants, there were nobles and courtiers who visited regularly. If the boys had been murdered in the Tower, someone would have known about it. Guards would have seen things. Servants would have witnessed preparations. Blood would have been visible. Bodies would have had to be disposed of. All of these actions would have left traces. Yet despite the many people who had access to the Tower, and despite the fact that 500 years have passed and much of the Tower's history has been documented, no definitive proof of the boys' murder has ever been found. This does not mean the murder did not happen. It simply means that either the murder was covered up so effectively that no traces remain, or the murder did not happen and the boys' fate is something else entirely. The mystery of the princes in the Tower has inspired enormous amounts of speculation, research, and creative interpretation. Historians have debated the case. Novelists have imagined various outcomes. Television documentaries have presented evidence and theories. Some historians have concluded that Richard III almost certainly murdered the boys. They argue that the motive is clear, the opportunity was available, and the suspicion that fell on Richard immediately after the disappearance suggests his guilt. Other historians have argued that Richard was innocent. They suggest that the evidence against him is circumstantial and that the damaging accounts were written by people who lived after his death and had reason to portray him as evil. Still, other historians have argued that the truth is simply unknown. We may never know what happened to the boys. The mystery may be permanently unsolved. The case of the princes in the Tower raises profound questions about power, innocence, and the nature of truth in history. First, it raises questions about the vulnerability of innocence in the face of political ambition. Two young boys, caught in a struggle for power among adults, simply disappeared. Whether they were murdered or escaped, or died of natural causes, their fate illustrates the danger faced by those without power in a world where power is pursued ruthlessly. Second, it raises questions about how history is written and remembered. The accounts we have of the princes in the Tower come largely from people who lived after the events. These accounts were influenced by the political needs of the time. The victors in the struggle for power had the ability to tell the story as they wished. The defeated had less voice in shaping the narrative. Third, it raises questions about the nature of truth. How much evidence is necessary to establish guilt? Suspicion and motive and opportunity are not proof. Yet sometimes in history, we never have definitive proof. We have only incomplete evidence, conflicting accounts and theories. Fourth, it raises questions about the responsibility of those in power. Regardless of whether Richard III murdered the boys, the fact remains that he had custody of them, and they disappeared under his watch. Whether through action or inaction, through murder or negligence, Richard bore some responsibility for their fate. Let's contemplate the human tragedy underlying the mystery. Two young boys, Edward, 13 years old, Richard, 8 years old. They were born into privilege and power. They were heirs to one of the great kingdoms of Europe. They had everything that the world could offer in terms of material comfort and status. But they also had vulnerability. They depended on adults to protect them. They had no control over their own lives. Their fate was determined by the political ambitions of powerful people around them. In the summer of 1483, these boys were visible at the windows of the Tower of London. They were looking out at a city that was no longer theirs. They were in a place that had become a prison, whether by design or circumstance. They were young and vulnerable and caught in forces beyond their control. Then they disappeared. What happened in those walls will never be known with certainty, but something happened that caused them to vanish from history. The Tower of London still stands. Stone walls surround the same spaces where the princes in the tower were kept. The urn containing the bones thought to be the prince's remains is in Westminster Abbey. Tourists walk through the tower every day, often unaware of the mystery that surrounds it. The mystery persists. 500 years later, we still do not know what happened to the princes in the tower. We have theories, we have evidence, we have historical accounts, but we do not have definitive proof of their fate. This uncertainty is part of what makes the story so compelling. The mystery endures. The questions remain. The truth remains hidden behind the walls of history. As we drift into sleep, contemplating the mystery of the princes in the tower, we contemplate several profound truths. First, that great mysteries can persist for centuries without being solved. Despite 500 years of research, investigation, and analysis, the fate of the princes in the tower remains unknown. History is not always clear. Truth is not always available. Second, that innocent people can be vulnerable to the ambitions of the powerful. The princes had no control over their circumstances. They were caught in a struggle for power among adults. Their fate illustrates the vulnerability of those without power. Third, that history is often written by the victors and can be shaped by their interests. The accounts of the princes in the tower were influenced by the political needs of those in power. The truth may be different from the stories that survive. Fourth, that absence of proof is not proof of innocence or guilt. We cannot prove that Richard III murdered the princes, but we also cannot prove that he did not. The mystery exists in this space of uncertainty. Fifth, that tragedy and mystery can persist even in the historical record. The disappearance of the princes in the tower is documented in historical accounts, yet the truth of what happened remains elusive. History preserves the mystery, but not necessarily the solution. Sleep knowing that great mysteries exist. Sleep knowing that some questions may never be answered. Sleep knowing that history is complex and ambiguous. Sleep knowing that the vulnerability of the innocent is a persistent theme throughout history. Sleep knowing that the princes in the tower disappeared 500 years ago, but their story still captures our imagination. Sleep knowing that the mystery has inspired novels, plays, films, and endless speculation. Sleep knowing that the human desire to solve mysteries, to understand the past, to know the truth, is as compelling as the mystery itself. Sleep peacefully, contemplating the enduring nature of mystery. Sleep with appreciation for the complexity of history. Sleep knowing that not all questions have answers, but the search for truth is what makes history compelling. Sleep knowing that somewhere in the Tower of London, in the stone walls and the passages and the chambers, the secret of the princes in the tower may forever remain. Sleep knowing that mystery is part of what makes history alive and vital. Good night from the Deep Sleep Channel. Sleep well and dream of medieval mysteries and unsolved questions that echo through the centuries.